just a few dozen meters. That was the distance between the school bus stop and the front door of her home. A distance so short that her stepfather could see it from the yard. A distance that should have been safe. And in the time it took him to look away and back again, an 11-year-old girl was gone. She vanished on a Monday morning in June, in a quiet mountain community where children still played freely outside and neighbors trusted one another. She was taken right in front of the one person who was supposed to keep her safe. And for 18 years, the world searched in entirely the wrong direction. What nobody knew, not her mother, not the FBI, not the dozens of law enforcement officers who would come and go over the following 2 decades, was that she had been hidden in a secret compound less than a 2-hour drive away. Hidden behind a fence. Behind tarps. Behind a system so ordinary on the outside that 60 separate checks by the very people responsible for finding exactly this kind of situation never once uncovered it. Until 2 campus officers with no warrant, no forensic equipment, and no special intelligence, only their instincts, saw something that made them pause. And what they uncovered on that August afternoon in 2009 shocked everyone who had spent years looking for answers. Before we go deeper into this story, let us know where you are watching from. And if stories like this one matter to you, consider subscribing so you do not miss what comes next. To understand what happened in the summer of 1991, you have to understand the world that existed in that moment. America was riding a wave of collective confidence. Troops had just returned from the Gulf War. Nirvana was on every radio. The Soviet Union was dissolving in real time on living room television sets, and the Cold War, a shadow that had defined entire generations, was officially ending. People felt protected. They felt like the dangerous chapter was closing. In Meyers, California, that feeling was especially easy to hold on to. Meyers is a small community of around 5,000 people nestled at 6,200 feet in the Sierra Nevada mountains, 5 miles southwest of South Lake Tahoe. Ponderosa pines covered the surrounding hillsides. Neighbors knew each other by name. Children rode their bikes without anyone checking the clock. It was exactly the kind of place where a parent could watch their child walk to the bus stop 30 meters away and feel, for that one moment, like nothing in the world could possibly go wrong. The Probin family lived in that neighborhood. Terry Probin was the mother. Carl Probin was the stepfather. And Jaycee Lee Dugard was 11 years old, blonde-haired, bright-eyed, remembered by everyone who knew her as the kind of kid who made a room feel lighter just by walking into it. She loved to laugh. She was cheerful in the way only children who have known genuine safety can be. On the morning of June 10, 1991, the school year was nearly over, and the particular happiness that comes with summer approaching was already in the air. Carl drove Jaycee to the bus stop, which was only a short walk from their front door. He let her out, turned back toward the house, and went to continue his morning chores in the yard. What happened next lasted only seconds. A gray sedan rolled to a stop beside Jaycee at the bus stop. A man climbed out. His name was Philip Craig Garrido, 40 years old, a resident of Antioch, California, a city 190 miles to the west. He pressed a stun gun against the 11-year-old and shoved her into the back of the vehicle. A woman named Nancy Garrido was sitting behind the wheel. The car pulled away. Carl Probin, still in his yard, looked up in time to see the gray car stop, the man step out, and his daughter being forced inside before the reality of what he was watching had even fully registered in his mind. He grabbed his bike and pedaled after them as hard as he could. The car turned a corner and disappeared. Carl stood in the road, staring at empty pavement, then turned and ran back inside to call 911. Several other witnesses in the area caught fragments of what happened, but no one had a license plate number, and no single account was detailed enough to produce a usable lead. The car was gray. The man was somewhere around 40. That was nearly all law enforcement had to work with. The El Dorado County Sheriff's Office, the state of California, and the FBI launched one of the largest searches in the county's history. Thousands of volunteers from across the South Lake Tahoe region flooded the area. Search dogs, helicopters, and the FBI Sacramento field office all came together. Tips poured in from across California and Nevada, hundreds of calls from people who thought they had seen something, heard something, knew something. Every single one was followed up. Every lead was checked. None of them led to Jaycee. The investigation stayed focused on the South Lake Tahoe area and the neighboring stretches of Nevada. It never extended west. It never reached Contra Costa County. It never touched Antioch, the East Bay city 190 miles away, where Philip Garrido lived, where he had already taken Jaycee, and where she would remain hidden for the next 18 years. While the search was concentrated in the mountains, Garrido was living quietly in a suburban neighborhood, and the case grew colder with every passing season. What makes this story impossible to look away from is not only what Garrido did, but who he was before he ever saw Jaycee Dugard at that bus stop, and how thoroughly the system that was supposed to contain him had already failed. In 1976, Garrido had kidnapped a woman named Catherine Calloway Hall in Nevada. He tied her up, dragged her to a storage shed, and sexually assaulted her for hours before police caught him. He was sentenced to 50 years in federal prison alongside a life sentence in state court. This was a sentence that was designed in the most deliberate legal language to make sure he would never have access to another victim again. He was released after 11 years. He walked out in 1988. 3 years later, he drove to Meyers. During his parole, Catherine Calloway Hall did something remarkable and painful. She went back to the system that had already failed her. She contacted his parole agent directly and warned them that Garrido was exhibiting dangerous behavior and needed closer supervision. She had lived through what he was capable of. She was telling them what she knew. The parole agent's recorded response was to note in the file that her concerns reflected her own hysteria, not any real threat. 3 years later, Garrido kidnapped an 11-year-old girl. The investigation into Jaycee's disappearance never connected Garrido to the gray sedan in Meyers. The two worlds, a sex offender with a kidnapping conviction living in Antioch, and the search, happening 190 miles northeast, never intersected. Not because the connection was impossible to make, but because no one was looking in that direction. Jaycee Lee Dugard was taken to 1554 Walnut Avenue in Antioch, California, a house on a suburban street. From the front, it looked like any other home in any other neighborhood. But behind it, obscured by tall fencing, dense trees, and tarps hung specifically to block the view from outside, Garrido had constructed a hidden compound. A collection of tents and crude sheds expanding across roughly 900 square feet of enclosed, invisible space. That was where he put Jaycee, and that was where she would stay. In the first years of her captivity, Jaycee had almost no contact with the outside world. No leaving the compound. No interaction with anyone outside of Philip and Nancy Garrido. No electricity, no running water, no school, no medical care. The 11-year-old girl who had been waiting for her bus in the Sierra Nevada mountains was now locked inside a world that one man controlled completely. Garrido began raping Jaycee almost immediately after taking her. This continued throughout her captivity. During the same period, his parole file was being updated regularly with notes indicating he was compliant with his conditions. In 1994, when Jaycee was 14 years old, she gave birth to her first daughter, Garrido's child. The birth happened inside the compound with no doctor, no hospital, no medical support of any kind for either the 14-year-old mother or the newborn. 3 years later, in 1997, when Jaycee was 17, she gave birth to a second daughter under the same conditions. The two girls grew up in the backyard. No school, no birth certificates. No documentation proving they existed anywhere in the outside world. When Garrido spoke about them to anyone who asked, he said they were his granddaughters. The arrival of her first child changed something fundamental inside Jaycee. She later wrote about it in her memoir, describing how becoming a mother gave her a reason to stay. Not just to survive for herself, but to protect someone who depended entirely on her. It gave her a framework for enduring what cannot be escaped, and it shaped every decision she made inside that compound for the years that followed. Garrido did not hold Jaycee and her daughters through physical force alone. He built an intricate architecture of psychological control across 18 years. He presented himself as a prophet with a divine mission, a man personally chosen by God to carry out a spiritual purpose. He constructed a closed reality inside the compound, a self-contained world with its own rules, its own beliefs, and its own logic, one that Jaycee and her daughters had known for so long that the broader world outside had become something distant and abstract. Jaycee wrote about this in A Stolen Life, her memoir published in 2011. She wrote honestly about the psychological complexity of surviving in those conditions, about why escape was not the straightforward act that people outside imagined it to be, and about the process of protecting her daughters within a situation that offered no clean exits. While all of this was happening inside the compound at Walnut Avenue, the federal parole system continued its routine. In the 10 years between 1999 and 2009, parole officers conducted 60 checks at Garrido's Antioch property. 60 separate visits. They knocked on the front door, spoke with Garrido, made notes in their files that conditions were being met, and left. 60 times. And in all 60 of those visits, not a single parole officer walked behind the house to inspect the backyard where the compound had been steadily growing for years. A full property inspection is not a discretionary procedure when the subject is a convicted sex offender with a documented history of kidnapping people and holding them in enclosed spaces. It is supposed to be a baseline requirement. But no one applied it here. Jaycee and her daughters were separated from those officers by nothing more than a fence and some hanging tarps. Every single time, law enforcement stood at the front door and turned around. In 2006, a neighbor called the Antioch Police Department. They reported that people appeared to be living in tents in Garrido's backyard and that they could hear the voices of children coming from behind the covered areas. Officers responded to 1554 Walnut Avenue. They spoke to Garrido at the front of the property. They did not go into the backyard. They filed a report stating that no issues had been found at the address and closed the matter. Jaycee, her 2 daughters, and 15 years of evidence were right on the other side of the gate those officers stood in front of before walking away. In 2008, the parole agency launched its own internal investigation after receiving information about Garrido's unusual activities. Investigators came to the property, questioned him about his behavior, and once again, nobody checked the compound behind the house. 1 year later, 2 people who were not career law enforcement officers, who carried no warrant and held no special jurisdiction, looked at Philip Garrido on a university campus and knew, instinctively, that something was deeply wrong. On August 24, 2009, Garrido arrived at the University of California, Berkeley campus accompanied by 2 teenage girls. They were his biological daughters, Jaycee's children. He was there to request permission to hold a religious gathering for his group, which he called God's Desire. Jaycee herself was not there. She was still in Antioch. The first person to deal with him was Lisa Campbell, the manager of the campus events office. Her job was to review permit requests. Nothing in her role required her to do anything more than process the application. But Garrido's behavior made her stop. Something about the way he talked, the fanatical edge in his voice when he described his religious mission, struck her as deeply unstable. And the 2 girls with him, who seemed hollowed out, eerily quiet, and entirely submissive, added to the unease she could not explain but could not ignore either. Campbell did not ask direct questions. She scheduled a follow-up appointment for the next afternoon, and as soon as Garrido left the office, she went directly to Officer Ally Jacobs of the UC Berkeley Police Department and told her everything she had observed. Jacobs ran a background check. What came back was immediate and alarming. Philip Garrido was a registered sex offender on federal parole for kidnapping and rape, a conviction going back to 1976. And critically, his parole file contained no record of him having children. Yet here he was on a university campus with 2 girls he was claiming were his daughters. On August 25th, Jacobs and Campbell sat through a second meeting with Garrido in Campbell's office, keeping everything calm, keeping everything routine, making sure he had no reason to suspect he was being watched while they arranged for parole to get involved. At one point during a meeting, Garrido reached into his bag and produced a self-published book he had written about schizophrenia. After he left, Jacobs picked up the phone and called Parole Officer Edward Santos Jr. directly. She told him about the girls. She told him about Garrido's behavior. She told him what they had both observed across 2 separate meetings. Santos recognized immediately that this was not routine information. None of it matched what was in Garrido's file. He summoned Garrido to the parole office in Concord the following day and instructed him to bring everyone with him. On August 26, 2009, Philip Garrido walked into the Concord parole office with Nancy Garrido, the 2 teenage girls, and a young woman he introduced as his niece. He had given her a different name. He called her Alyssa. Investigators separated each person for individual questioning. During the interrogation that followed, Garrido eventually confessed. He had kidnapped Jaycee Lee Dugard in Meyers, California in June of 1991. The young woman sitting in that interrogation room, who had spent 18 years living under the name Alyssa inside a tent compound in a backyard in Antioch, confirmed who she really was. The 11-year-old girl who had been standing at a bus stop in the mountains, whose stepfather had chased the kidnapper's car on a bicycle and lost it around a corner, was now 29 years old and speaking her real name aloud to law enforcement for the first time in nearly 2 decades. On the night of August 26th, Jaycee and her 2 daughters were taken by authorities to a safe location. The FBI arranged a phone call between Jaycee and her mother Terry Probyn, who was in Southern California at the time. It was the first time the two had heard each other's voices in 18 years, 2 months, and 16 days. The next morning, Terry flew north. She walked into the same room as her daughter for the first time since 1991, and she met the two granddaughters she had never known existed. Aunt Tina Dugard was there at the reunion. She later described it to reporters by saying the smile on her sister's face was as wide as the ocean. Her oldest daughter was finally home. They laughed. They cried. They sat together and breathed the same air. And then came the detail that made everyone who had been searching for Jaycee stop and absorb the weight of those 18 years in an entirely new way. Jaycee had not been hidden far away. She had been in Antioch, California, a drive of under 2 hours from South Lake Tahoe, less than 200 miles from home. While Terry Probyn had searched across California and Nevada, praying that her daughter was alive somewhere out there, Jaycee had been within reach the entire time. Philip and Nancy Garrido were arrested at the Concord Parole Office on August 26, 2009. The list of charges was substantial. Kidnapping, false imprisonment, multiple counts of rape, including rape in conjunction with kidnapping, lewd acts with a minor under 14, and numerous additional charges tied to 18 years of sustained criminal conduct. Both entered initial pleas of not guilty. The proceedings stretched on for nearly 2 years. In April of 2011, Philip Garrido pleaded guilty to 1 count of kidnapping and 13 counts of sexual assault, including 6 counts of rape and 7 counts of lewd acts. Nancy Garrido pleaded guilty to 1 count of kidnapping and 1 count of forcible rape. Prosecutors had agreed to reduce certain charges against Nancy in exchange for Philip entering a near-complete guilty plea on the full indictment. Both waived their right to appeal. The arrangement was structured specifically so that Jaycee and her daughters would not have to testify in open court. Jaycee released a statement the day both entered their pleas. She wrote that she was relieved they had finally admitted their guilt and confessed to what they had done to her and her family. In June of 2011, the sentencing hearing took place at El Dorado County Superior Court in Placerville. Jaycee was not in the courtroom. She chose not to be there. In her written statement, she said she refused to waste 1 more second of her life in his presence. She wrote that everything he did was wrong. She wrote about hating every second of every day across 18 years. She wrote that he had stolen her life and the life of her family. She also addressed Nancy Garrido directly in her statement, writing that there was no version of God in this universe who accepted what she had done. She hoped they would both face as many sleepless nights as she had been forced to endure. Terry Probyn stood in that courtroom and read her daughter's words aloud to everyone present. Judge Douglas C. Pfister called Philip Garrido the textbook definition of a predatory sex offender and sentenced him to 431 years to life in prison. Nancy Garrido received 36 years to life, the maximum sentence available under the laws in effect in 1991 when the crimes were committed. Philip Garrido, 60 years old at sentencing, would not be eligible for parole consideration for several decades. The length of the sentence was constructed to ensure he would die inside a California prison. After the verdicts, the attention turned to something the sentences themselves could not address: the system, the specific, compounding, bureaucratic failures that had allowed all of this to happen inside the boundaries of a functioning legal structure. Garrido was a registered sex offender on active federal parole for kidnapping and rape when he took Jaycee. The system knew exactly what he had done before. It had a file on him. It had requirements in place specifically designed for people like him. And still, across 18 years, dozens of parole officers stood at his front door, noted compliance, and walked away without ever checking the space just behind it. A neighbor called the police in 2006 with specific information about people living in tents and children's voices coming from behind covered fencing. Officers responded, spoke to Garrido at the entrance to his property, and closed the call without entering the backyard. An internal parole investigation came to the property in 2008. No one checked the compound. Jaycee filed a civil lawsuit against the state of California for those failures. California settled for $20 million, the largest settlement in the state's history for parole system negligence. That settlement was not just a payment. It was an official acknowledgement that what happened to Jaycee Dugard over those 18 years was not only the criminal act of 2 people. It was also the consequence of a system that had the tools to prevent it and failed, repeatedly and at multiple points, to use them. In the years since her rescue, Jaycee Dugard rebuilt her life. Her former therapist described her publicly as someone living remarkably well, someone who carried pride in what she had built since leaving Antioch. In 2011, she published A Stolen Life, a memoir that became a bestseller not because it dwelled in the darkest corners of what she had endured, but because it told an honest and unflinching truth about human psychology under extreme circumstances, the kind of truth that only the person who lived through it could tell accurately. She founded the Jaycee Foundation, an organization dedicated to supporting families and victims of abduction with a particular focus on the difficult process of reintegration. Because what the standard medical and legal systems are not built to handle is the complexity of returning to a world you left behind as a child. She understood that from the inside, and she built something to address it. No one had the right to demand that of her. No one could have asked it. She chose it. There are 3 lessons from this case that reach far beyond the Garrido compound on Walnut Avenue. The first is about what happens when systems ignore the people who know the most. Catherine Calloway Hall contacted Garrido's parole agent. She told them directly that he was continuing dangerous behavior. She was the one person in the world with the clearest knowledge of what he was capable of. And the agent documented her warning as hysteria. 3 years later, Garrido kidnapped a child. The parole and court systems responsible for managing sex offenders must take the warnings of victims seriously, not as emotional noise to be dismissed, but as evidence to be weighed. The second is about the 60 checks that stopped at the front door. This was not one person making one mistake. This was a systemic design failure. When a convicted sex offender with a documented history of kidnapping and confining victims is on parole supervision, a conversation at the entrance to his property is not a property check. It is the appearance of a property check. The $20 million settlement California paid is a legal admission that this was a structural failure, not just a human one. The third is about Lisa Campbell and Ally Jacobs. Neither of them had a warrant. Neither had forensic tools or special intelligence. What they had was the willingness to pay attention to something that felt wrong, and to act on that feeling rather than explain it away. They did what 60 official checks had not done. Not because they were more skilled, but because they looked. If you are ever in a situation where a child seems frightened, where an adult is exercising a level of control over those around them that does not make sense, where something in the scene you are witnessing makes the back of your mind quietly insist that something is not right, report it. You do not need to be certain. You do not need evidence. You only need to make the call and let someone else determine what it means. Because one phone call, one instinct acted on instead of dismissed, is what separated 18 more years of silence from the truth finally coming out. If you have watched this far, leave a comment and let us know where in the world you are watching from.